When my daughter told me the best wedding gift I could give her was to not show my face at all, I didn't shout. I didn't even ask her why. I just smiled. I smiled because I had already lost her long before that day. A message like that doesn't hurt unless there's still something left to lose. And for me, she had already gone years ago. Little by little, birthday by birthday, silence by silence. But still, something in me had hoped. I hoped that maybe, just maybe this day, her wedding day, would be the one where she would look at me the way she used to when she was 6 years old and held my hand in a crowd. But that day never came. What came instead was a cold text message from an unknown number, her fiancé's. She said she'd really appreciate it if you didn't come. It's just easier this way. I stared at the screen for a while, waiting to feel something more than what I already knew. But there was nothing, just numbness. I sat in my car, outside the church, dressed in the same suit I wore to her high school graduation. I had even bought a tie in her favorite color. I hadn't worn it since she was 16, since the day she told me she didn't need me at her college tour. That was the first time she pulled away. I thought it was just growing up. I thought it would pass. But slowly, she stopped calling. She stopped visiting. She stopped asking questions about my life, about my health, about anything at all. I became background noise. The man who raised her but didn't matter anymore. I still paid for her car. I still sent her birthday cards with checks she never cashed. I still waited by the phone every Father's Day, hoping maybe, just maybe, she'd call. But she didn't. So when that message came, part of me wasn't surprised. What surprised me more was that I still showed up. I still parked outside that church. I still held the card I wrote for her in my pocket, folded 3 times. I didn't write anything dramatic, just one line. I hope you find someone who never stops showing up for you. I was going to slip it under her bouquet when no one was looking. That was my plan. No scene, no drama. Just a father leaving something behind for a daughter who had already moved on. But that message changed everything. Not because of what it said, but because of how little effort it took to say it. Not even a call, not even her voice. Just a message from the man she was marrying, as if I was a guest who needed uninviting. I thought about replying. I thought about calling her. I thought about sitting in the back row anyway, just to see her smile once more. But I didn't. I did what she asked. I started the car. I drove away. I passed the bakery where we used to get donuts after church. I passed the park where she learned to ride her bike. I passed everything that used to mean something to us, and it felt like all of it was erasing itself behind me, like none of it ever mattered. But then I stopped, at a small intersection where an old diner sat glowing in the morning light. I hadn't been there in years, but she used to love the pancakes there. That's where she told me she wanted to be a teacher. She was 10 years old, and her feet didn't reach the floor, and she said it with so much certainty that I told every single person I met that week. I parked the car. I walked in. I sat at the booth where we used to sit. The same waitress was there, older now, but she smiled and said, "Haven't seen you in a while?" I just nodded. I ordered coffee. I didn't touch it. I pulled out my phone and stared at that message again, and then I made one phone call. Just one. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because there are some lines you don't cross, and asking a father not to show up on his daughter's wedding day, that's a line. The person I called knew everything. They had known us for years. They were family, even if not by blood. I told them exactly what happened. I didn't raise my voice. I just told the truth, and they listened. And when I hung up, I didn't feel better. I didn't feel worse. I just felt done, like something had closed, like a chapter that wrote itself for too long had finally reached its last line. I left the diner. I didn't go home. I drove to the cemetery. Her mother's grave is there, beneath a large oak tree. She would have worn a pink dress to the wedding. She would have told our daughter that no matter what, you never turn your back on the people who gave you everything. I knelt down and placed the card on the grave instead. I told her everything. I told her what our daughter had said. And I said I was sorry. Not for me, but for the child we had raised, who forgot what it means to carry love through distance. I stayed there for a long time. And then I left. An hour later, my phone rang. I didn't answer. It rang again. Then a third time, voicemails, then texts. I didn't check them right away. I already knew what had happened, because when someone makes a phone call like the one I made, it doesn't go unnoticed. 1 hour later, the groom's family arrived at the wedding. They didn't go inside. They didn't take their seats. They asked to speak with the bride. There was no music playing when they did. No laughter. Just confusion. And then silence. The kind of silence that spreads through a room like a cold wind. A silence that means something terrible has just been said. 10 minutes later, the wedding was off. The flowers stayed in their vases. The cake stayed in the fridge. The guests stayed seated until someone told them to go. My daughter cried. She tried calling me. She left a message saying, "Why would you do this?" But I didn't answer, because she already knew. She already knew. That's the part that haunts me more than anything. Not her message, not the look on her face when the groom's family turned around and left, not even the way her voice cracked in that voicemail asking what I had done. It's the knowing. The part of her that always knew what I was capable of. Because deep down, I think she always feared that quiet side of me. The one that doesn't yell, doesn't break things, doesn't beg, just listens, absorbs, waits, and then acts. That side of me was built after her mother died. I learned to hold grief in my teeth without letting it show. I learned to go to work, pay the bills, pack her lunch, and sit in her school office with a calm face while other parents judged my unshaved jaw and the tiredness under my eyes. I learned to celebrate birthdays with fake joy and tuck her in at night while crying into my shirt. And I never once let it out. Never once blamed her for how much she reminded me of the woman I lost. I carried it all, quietly, until the weight just became part of me. And I thought, after all of that, she'd see it. She'd understand. Maybe not when she was a teenager or in college, or even when she got engaged. But someday. Someday she'd sit down and realize her father gave her everything without asking for anything back. But she never did. Instead, she wrote me out of her story in soft, silent steps. First it was missed calls, then unanswered texts, then holidays spent with friends. Then suddenly I wasn't on the invitation list for her bridal shower. When I asked, she said, "Oh, it was just for girls." I smiled and said I understood. And when she didn't ask me to walk her down the aisle, I told myself maybe she was nervous. Maybe it was just easier to keep things simple. But then that message came, asking me not to show up at all, and all the pretending had to stop. I had spent years explaining away her distance, making excuses for her coldness, but at some point, the excuses stop sounding like love and start sounding like desperation. And I wasn't desperate. Not anymore. That's why I didn't reply. That's why I drove away. That's why I made that one phone call. And now everything was broken. And she knew exactly who broke it. She just didn't understand why. But here's the thing about people like me. We don't break things for revenge. We break them for truth. Because sometimes the only way someone sees what they've done is by watching something they built collapse in their hands. And I had given her everything she needed to keep it standing. Every check, every loan, every conversation I never brought up again. I gave her my silence as a gift. And when she told me not to come, I realized she never saw any of it. She saw me as a burden, a shadow, an old man clinging to moments she had already deleted from her memory. And maybe that's the cruelest part, how easy it is for people to forget who held them up when they couldn't even walk. So yes, I called someone, not to ruin her life, but to remind her who built it. The person I called had proof, photos, documents, messages, things I never meant to use, things I collected only because I knew someday I'd need to protect myself from the version of me she was telling people about. The controlling father, the absent parent, the man who always made things about himself. I knew her words would travel through mouths that never met me, so I stayed quiet. But I saved everything, and the person I called had it all too. They asked me one question, "Are you sure?" And I said yes. Not because I wanted her hurt, but because I was done letting her rewrite a story I lived through. I told them to deliver it all to the groom's father. Not the groom, not the bride. Just him. Because he was old enough to understand what truth looks like when it's been buried for too long. And he did. When he saw it, he didn't shout. He didn't storm out. He just stood there in the lobby of the hotel, holding the folder in one hand and his son's boutonniere in the other. Then he walked out of the building, straight past the guests, past the wedding planner, past the photographers, and into the room where my daughter was getting ready. She didn't see him coming. She was smiling, laughing with her bridesmaids, holding a champagne glass like she hadn't just cut her father out of the biggest day of her life. And then she saw his face, and the smile faded. She asked him what was wrong. He didn't say anything. He just handed her the folder. She opened it, and that's when everything changed. 10 minutes later, the wedding was off. She tried calling me 3 times that day. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, but because I had nothing left to say. Everything I could have said was already in that folder. Every sacrifice, every dollar, every truth she chose to forget. And when people asked her what happened, she couldn't answer. Because if she told them, she'd have to admit what she'd done. So she disappeared. She went silent. No posts, no updates, just vanished into a cloud of shame and confusion. And I stayed quiet too. Because I wasn't trying to humiliate her. I just wanted her to understand that love doesn't disappear just because you stop acknowledging it. Love is memory. And memory doesn't fade for the people who lived through the worst of it. I lived through it. Every scraped knee, every missed recital because I had to work overtime. Every night she cried for her mother, and I had to pretend I knew how to comfort a little girl with a heart too broken for bedtime stories. I held all of that. And she gave it all away for a wedding photo without me in it. And maybe she thought that would be enough. Maybe she thought she could delete me from her life and still keep the love I gave her. But that's not how this works. You don't get to keep the house and burn the foundation. And so, when she asked me what I had done, all I could think was, I reminded you who poured the cement. I didn't expect her to call me again. After the first few missed calls and the message she left that night, I thought maybe she'd vanish for a while. Maybe go somewhere quiet and let the shame settle. But she didn't. She kept calling. Once the next morning. Again after lunch. A third time before the sun went down. Each time from the same number, no messages, just silence waiting on the other end of my phone. I never picked up. Not because I was angry. I had moved beyond anger long ago. It was something else now. Something colder, older. A kind of grief you only feel when someone you love dies in front of you, but they're still breathing. Because that's what this felt like mourning someone who wasn't even gone. She was alive. But the version of her that used to sit beside me on the porch with scraped knees and peanut butter on her face, that version had disappeared years ago. I think I kept hoping she'd come back. That maybe under all the distance and grown-up pride and carefully curated social media life, my daughter still remembered who held her through every fever, every school panic, every heartbreak she thought would break her. But she didn't. And now that everything had cracked open, I think she realized how deep her own erasure went. She hadn't just forgotten me, she had erased me. And it wasn't one moment. It was death by 1,000 small silences. When she chose not to ask how I was doing, when she chose not to invite me to Thanksgiving, when she told her friends her father wasn't really around, even though I was the only one who ever stayed. And I never corrected her. I thought love meant letting her rewrite me however she needed. I thought my silence was compassion. But silence, given too long, turns into permission. And now she was living inside a version of the truth where I had never really mattered, until the wedding fell apart, until the man she thought would protect her walked away with a folder full of the life she never asked about. And now, for the first time in years, she was trying to find me. Not to reconnect, but to control the damage. Because that's what this was now. Damage control. Her calls weren't apologies, they were panic. She wanted answers. She wanted to know who I had spoken to, what I had shared, how far the truth had spread. But I stayed quiet. Because sometimes silence is the only answer that tells the whole story. She had spent years showing me what I meant to her. And now I was showing her what that meant to me. It wasn't revenge. I wasn't out to ruin her. I just didn't want to be erased quietly anymore. I didn't want to sit in the back of a church watching a slideshow of her life where my face never showed up. I didn't want to keep pretending that the man who paid for her first car, her university tuition, her first apartment deposit, and even some of her wedding costs didn't exist. Because for years, I watched her smile in photos where I wasn't invited. I watched her post captions about self-made success, knowing exactly what bills were still being paid by my account, and I told myself it was okay, that maybe that's just what growing up looked like. But it wasn't. It was something else, something colder, something selfish. And when she told me not to come to the wedding, that was the last nail. I remember sitting alone in my kitchen that night, looking at the envelope with the check I had written to help her with the venue. It hadn't even been cashed yet. She hadn't returned it either. She just pretended like it never came, like the money just fell from the sky. And I realized, with a kind of clarity that almost scared me, that I had been part of a fantasy she had been building for years. One where she was independent, powerful, in control, and I had played along, willingly, quietly, because I thought she needed it. I thought giving her the image she wanted was a kind of love, but now I could see what it cost. It cost me my place in her life, my name, my presence. And now that the fantasy had cracked, she was scrambling to fix it, not to bring me back in, but to keep me quiet. That's what those calls were? Not a daughter trying to come home, but a woman trying to hold on to her illusion, and I couldn't be part of that anymore. So I let the phone ring. I let it buzz beside my bed. I let the screen light up with her name over and over until finally it stopped. And in the silence that followed, I felt something strange. Not guilt, not sadness, but peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing her. I wasn't waiting for an invitation that would never come. I wasn't replaying old memories, trying to find out where I went wrong. I was just sitting, breathing, and letting it all settle. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be lived. And the truth was, I had given her everything. She had given me distance. And now we were finally even. Or at least I thought we were. But life doesn't end neatly like that. Pain has a way of circling back. Regret has a way of showing up when you least expect it. And forgiveness? Forgiveness never comes when you need it. It comes when you're already too far gone to ask for it. A week passed, then 2, then 3. No calls, no texts, nothing. I thought that was the end, that she had decided to disappear again. I told myself I was fine with that, but part of me waited, not hopefully, just quietly. Then on the 4th week, a letter came, handwritten. No return address, just my name in ink I recognized instantly, her handwriting. The same loops and curves I used to see on thank you cards she wrote for birthdays and teacher gifts. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it. I thought maybe this was it. The apology, the understanding, the moment we both stopped pretending and finally saw each other. But it wasn't. It wasn't even close. But it wasn't even close. The letter didn't start with "I'm sorry" or "I understand." It started with "I just want to know why." That was the first sentence. 5 words. Nothing else on that line. The next part came slowly, like she had rewritten it too many times. She said she didn't understand what I had done, or why the groom's family suddenly turned cold. She said no one would speak to her anymore, that she was being ghosted, and even his sister had blocked her number. She said she heard rumors, things about secrets, about documents, about money. But no one would say anything to her face. She said she was humiliated, that she cried for days, that she couldn't sleep, that her friends kept asking if the wedding was postponed or canceled, and she didn't know what to say. She said she wanted to talk to me, but I wouldn't answer, that I was being cruel, that I had no right to punish her like this. And that sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because it hurt, but because of how completely it missed the point. I wasn't punishing her. That would mean I still wanted something from her. I didn't. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I wasn't trying to teach her a lesson. I had stopped reaching for that a long time ago. This wasn't about revenge. This was about release. Letting go of a story I had been forced to live inside for too long. A story where I was silent and helpful and invisible. Where I gave and gave and gave and in return was made to disappear quietly so that her life could look shinier, cleaner, simpler. I didn't fit the version of success she wanted to show the world. I was too real, too worn down, too flawed. She didn't say any of this in the letter, of course, but I had lived it. I had felt it. In the way she flinched when I showed up in jeans instead of a suit. In the way she rushed to correct me at dinner parties. In the way she told people I worked with numbers when I had built 2 small businesses with my own hands. I was something to manage, to hide, to smooth over. And now, without warning, I had stepped out of the shadows. I had shown a part of myself, and maybe a part of her, that didn't match the narrative she had written. And she hated that. She called it sabotage. She called it betrayal. But I had never once lied to her. I had just kept quiet. And maybe that was my biggest mistake. Maybe silence isn't love. Maybe it's just cowardice. I let her believe the version of life that made her feel most in control. I paid her bills from the background. I sent gifts with no notes. I funded dreams I was never invited to witness. I thought that was what a good parent did. But now I realized I had become a ghost in my own story. And now the living were angry the ghost had spoken. The rest of the letter was messier. It lost its structure. The lines bled into each other. She asked again and again, "What did you tell them? What did they see? How did you know who to call?" She begged for an explanation, not because she wanted to understand me, but because she wanted to control the narrative again. She wanted to fix the optics, patch the holes, reclaim her image. She wrote, "You embarrassed me." That sentence, just that. Not, "You hurt me" or "You abandoned me." Just, "You embarrassed me." Like that was the unforgivable crime. Like her shame mattered more than my absence. I set the letter down after that line. I couldn't read anymore. I just sat there, letting the words hang in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned the house down. She still didn't see it. After everything. She still didn't see me. She only saw the fallout. And in that moment, something hardened in me. Not hatred, not even anger, just a deep, final kind of closing. A door that had been cracked open for too long, finally shutting. I folded the letter carefully. I didn't rip it. I didn't throw it away. I just placed it back in the envelope and tucked it in a drawer. I wasn't ready to destroy it, but I wasn't ready to answer it either. Some things don't need replies. Some things are their own answer. The next morning, I went for a walk. I passed the church she was supposed to be married in. The flowers were gone. The ribbons had been taken down. It looked like nothing had ever happened. Just a building, quiet and ordinary. And I realized that's how these things end. Not with shouting, not with fireworks, but with quiet erasure. 1 week, it's the happiest place in your world. The next, it's just brick and silence. I sat on the bench across the street for a while, watching people pass, wondering how many of them had loved someone so much they let themselves vanish. I had been doing that for years, melting into the background of her life, thinking that's what love looked like. But it wasn't. Love isn't disappearing. Love is showing up. Love is being seen, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's not perfect, even when it ruins the photo. And maybe that's why I finally did what I did. Not to hurt her, but to exist. To prove, even just once, that I had been there all along, that I mattered, that I wasn't just a name on a check or a photo left out of the album. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to say thank you. I just needed to be real. And I think deep down, she knew that. That's why she kept calling. That's why she sent the letter. Not because she wanted to fix us, but because she wanted to put me back in the drawer. Neatly folded. Quiet. Contained. But I don't fit there anymore. I won't. The next day, another envelope came. Not from her. From the groom's father. Just 2 pages. A formal note and a copy of something I never expected to see again. The contract. The one I had drafted quietly months ago. When I first realized she was leaving me out of everything. It was signed, stamped, legal, and it confirmed something she never thought I'd do. Something she never thought I'd have the courage to protect. My name was on the deed. My name was on the fund. My name was on everything she had tried to claim as hers. And now she had nothing left to erase me from. And she knew it. That's why the last sentence of her letter stayed with me longer than anything else. She wrote, "I don't even know who you are anymore." And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile you wear when something is funny. It wasn't light. It wasn't proud. It was the kind of smile that just happens. Like your body finally releases a weight you didn't know it was holding. It was the smile of someone who had spent years holding their breath and was finally exhaling. I folded the paper once more, placed it back in the envelope. Then I sat there in the same spot for maybe an hour. Nothing moved. Not the clock. Not the air. I don't think I even blinked. I just kept thinking about how long it took me to get here. Not physically, but emotionally. How long I let her talk over me, reframe things, rewrite memories. How long I played the part she assigned me. The dependable one. The one who always picked up. The one who never asked questions. The one who smiled in family photos even when I was the one taking them. I think there's a kind of grief that comes not when you lose someone, but when you finally see them clearly. And I was grieving the idea of her, not the real person. The real version had asked me on her wedding day not to show up, because my presence would make her uncomfortable, because I reminded her of things she didn't want to explain, things that weren't pretty enough for the version of life she was trying to curate. And I was finally starting to understand she didn't want me gone because she hated me. She wanted me gone because I didn't fit the picture. I didn't fit her lie. And some people will do anything to protect the image they built, even if it means cutting out the people who helped them survive in the first place. That's what made this harder. She wasn't a villain. She was just scared. Scared of being average. Scared of being seen. Scared of being her father's daughter. I think she always thought she was escaping something when she moved out, that she was building a better life. But the truth is, I wasn't holding her back. I was holding her up, quietly, consistently, without ever asking to be noticed. I was the net under her tightrope, the foundation under her glass castle. And the second she thought she didn't need it anymore, she acted like it never existed. But even glass castles shatter. All it takes is one truth, one moment of honesty, one mirror held too long. And that's what I gave her. Not an attack, not a punishment, just a mirror. I think somewhere in her letter, she knew that. She just didn't know how to say it. So she asked questions instead. Why? How? When? As if the timeline mattered more than the truth. As if finding out when I made the call would undo the fact that I made it. But I wasn't interested in her timeline anymore. I had spent too many years living inside it. Now I had my own. My days weren't measured by her needs, her milestones, her emergencies. They were mine. And they were quiet, peaceful. I started taking walks without my phone. I stopped checking email. I planted tomatoes in the backyard and watched them grow, slowly, imperfectly, but real. And I started writing again. Not for anyone else, not to publish, just to remember who I was before I became her shadow. I found old notebooks buried in boxes, scribbles from a version of me that used to dream, before bills, before guilt, before the constant ache of being invisible in someone else's story. And the more I read, the more I remembered. I used to laugh louder. I used to ask questions. I used to take up space. I don't think it's a coincidence that all of that stopped around the same time she started to rise. It wasn't her fault entirely. I let it happen. I stepped aside. I made myself small so she could feel big. And maybe that's what parenting looks like sometimes. But it shouldn't last forever. You shouldn't have to disappear for your child to shine. There's room for both. There's always room for both. Unless they build their life assuming there isn't, then your presence becomes a threat, a liability, a crack in their carefully edited story. And that's what I had become, a liability. She didn't say those words. She didn't have to. I read them in her choices. The way she handed me the wedding invite and said, "It's going to be small," even though she knew I had paid for half the venue. The way she asked me to wear something neutral, so the photos would feel cohesive. The way she mentioned every vendor by name, except the one who had funded the entire event. Me. It was like watching someone slowly erase you in real time. Smile by smile, request by request. Until finally, the last ask came. The best gift would be if you didn't show up. And I gave it to her. But gifts have weight. And this one, she couldn't carry. Not once the truth started slipping out. Not once the groom's family saw the documents. Not once people started asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Because for years, I had stayed silent. And now, one signature was speaking louder than all her edits. She couldn't fix it. She couldn't explain it away. Because I hadn't done anything wrong. I had just stopped playing along. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Because if I could step out of the shadows, maybe others would too. Maybe the whole story would start to look different. And maybe she'd have to look at herself, not just the version she sold to everyone else. That's the thing about control. Once you start losing it, you don't spiral because someone hurt you. You spiral because you realize you were never in control to begin with. And that's what I saw in her silence. In the way she stopped calling after the second letter came. In the way she posted nothing for weeks, no photos, no captions, no explanation, just a digital void, like she was holding her breath waiting for the narrative to settle. But it didn't. People talk, people ask, and eventually, someone always says too much. I didn't feed it. I didn't spread anything. I didn't answer when her friends reached out. I didn't comment when my brother sent me articles trying to piece it all together. I just lived. Quietly. Authentically. And that was enough. Because sometimes survival is the loudest revenge. Sometimes peace is the sharpest weapon. And sometimes the best thing you can do is nothing at all. Let them wonder. Let them question. Let them feel the silence you once drowned in. It teaches them more than any answer ever could. A few weeks later, I got another envelope. Smaller this time. No return address. Just my name, handwritten. Inside was a photo from the wedding rehearsal, one I hadn't seen before. She was smiling. He was holding her hand. And in the background, blurred but unmistakable, was me, standing just outside the frame, holding a box, wearing the same shirt she said was too loud. And for a second, I just stared at it, because I hadn't realized someone had taken that photo. I hadn't realized I was even visible. But there I was, faded, software, still part of the picture, even if she tried to crop me out later. And that's when it hit me. No matter how hard they try to rewrite the past, the truth always finds its way back in. Even in the background, even in the blur, even in the quiet, we remain. That sentence echoed in my head for days. I didn't speak it out loud. I didn't write it down. But I heard it every time I poured my coffee in the morning, every time the wind slipped through the screen door and lifted the corner of an old photo on the counter. We remain. Not because we fight, not because we make noise, but because memory is stubborn, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, never rots. I didn't plan what came next. People like to believe that revenge is some cinematic orchestration, a dramatic unveiling, a speech, a slap. But the real thing, the kind that leaves scars, is slow. It's silent. It's something you feel before you even realize you're watching it unfold. And that's exactly what started to happen. Quietly. Naturally. As if the world itself had grown tired of her story and was ready to read a different one. It began with a call I didn't answer. A mutual friend, someone who had always played both sides, left a voicemail asking if I'd heard the rumors. I hadn't. I didn't want to. So I deleted it. But curiosity has its own gravity, and by the next morning, 3 more messages had come in. Each one tiptoeing around something they didn't want to say directly. That's how you know a lie is unraveling. When people start speaking in fragments, avoiding names, using words like situation and unexpected. I made a cup of tea and stared out the window. I didn't want this. Not like this. I had imagined distance, maybe even silence, but not collapse. Not the slow, visible descent of someone who had once stood so tall in my eyes. Still, I said nothing. I didn't call. I didn't ask. I just waited. And that's when the letter came. A different kind this time. Typed, formal, from her fiancé's family. Not addressed to me directly, but forwarded through my lawyer, who I'd asked to handle everything after the wedding, just in case. I didn't expect to need him again, but life has its timing, and people have their thresholds. The letter was brief, polite, but there was no mistaking the message. The engagement had been formally terminated. Irreconcilable misrepresentations, it said. concerns regarding financial disclosures. I read the sentences again and again, not because I didn't understand, but because I couldn't believe they were real. It had happened. They'd seen it. Whatever I left behind in that folder, it was enough, more than enough, and not because it was malicious, but because it was true, and the truth, once touched, can't be untouched. I leaned back in my chair, stared at the ceiling. My heart wasn't racing. My hands didn't shake. I just felt still, like something enormous had moved beneath me, like tectonic plates shifting after decades of silence. I thought about calling her, about hearing her voice, even just once more. But then I remembered her letter, the way she asked me not to come, not to speak, not to interfere. So I honored that. I let her live inside the silence she created. And that silence, over time, began to speak louder than either of us ever could. I don't know what happened in those days after. Not exactly. But the ripples started showing up in strange places. An old coworker of mine sent me a screenshot from a wedding planning blog. The post had been taken down, but not before people noticed that the couple's profile had vanished. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Did they postpone?" I didn't reply. Because how do you explain a story that's still unfolding? How do you talk about a quiet undoing that no one is supposed to see? You don't. You just let it breathe. Let the air fill with questions. Let the truth find its own way out. Because it always does. A few nights later, I sat by the window with a cup of mint tea. It had started raining. Soft. Not angry. The kind of rain that feels like a conversation you've been avoiding. And I thought about her. Not as a bride. Not as a daughter, but as a person. A woman trying to build a life without acknowledging the bricks she stole to do it. I didn't hate her. I didn't even feel angry. I just felt distant. Like the version of her I once loved had moved to another country and changed her name. Maybe that's what grief really is. Not pain, but distance. A realization that someone is no longer reachable in the way they once were, and that no apology, no conversation, no moment can bring them back. So you stop trying. You just let them drift, and you start building something new in the space they used to take up. Something softer, something truer. That week, I opened an old storage box in my garage, one I hadn't touched since the day she left for college. Inside were birthday cards, childhood drawings, a dried flower from a recital bouquet. I ran my fingers over each object like they might remember something I'd forgotten. A time when she looked at me with wonder, when her eyes lit up just because I walked in the room. Before image, before pride, before erasure, I sat there for over an hour, surrounded by her handwriting, her glitter pens, her lopsided hearts, and I thought, maybe I wasn't grieving her. Maybe I was grieving myself. The version of me who thought love was enough, who thought sacrifice would be returned, who thought presence was the same as being seen. I closed the box, carried it back inside, and that night, for the first time in years, I slept without waking once. Because something had shifted, not outside, but in me. A quiet knowing, a line drawn, a door closed not out of spite, but out of mercy. And that mercy was for me. Because there comes a time when you stop chasing clarity, when you stop offering explanations to people who never listened in the first place, when you stop bleeding for someone who never brought you a bandage. And that time, for me, had finally come. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release, like walking away from a burning building and realizing your lungs are full of clean air again. That weekend, I went to the farmer's market alone. I bought peaches, listened to a street musician, let the sun warm my face without checking my phone. And in the middle of the crowd, for just a moment, I felt invisible again, but in a different way. Not erased, not excluded, just unburdened. A man bumped into me and apologized. I smiled and said, "No worries." And I meant it, because there were none. No worries, no weight, no walking on glass, just me, breathing, existing. Enough. When I got home, there was another letter in the mailbox. Same handwriting, same envelope. This time, no photo. Just 3 words on a torn scrap of notebook paper. Was it you? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because some questions are just mirrors in disguise. And the people asking them already know what they'll see. She didn't send another letter after that. Not the next day, not the next week. But I saw her name appear again. Not in ink this time, but in whispers. The kind of conversations that start when someone lowers their voice at brunch, the kind that are shaped more by what's not said than what is. It's just strange, isn't it? Did you hear why? I heard it was something to do with... But the sentence would always trail off. Like people knew that whatever had happened, it wasn't theirs to narrate. That's the thing about collapse. If it's quiet enough, it scares people more. Loud explosions make sense. But a person disappearing from their own spotlight? That gets under the skin. It didn't take long before the curated posts were gone. The engagement shoot, the countdown, the blessed beyond measure captions. All of it. Wiped clean like it never happened. And in its place, silence. No explanations, no apologies. Just a gap, like a page torn out of a photo album. I didn't watch it all unfold intentionally, but some things find you even when you're not looking. A tagged photo removed, a business profile mysteriously on pause, friends posting group shots without her, no longer standing center frame, no longer tagged first, and yet, through it all, I said nothing. Not because I wanted to seem powerful, but because I had nothing left to say. Everything I needed to express had already been folded into that moment at the church. The moment she asked me not to come. She may not have realized it then, but that sentence was a door. And once I walked through it, I didn't plan to return. People say closure is a conversation, a reckoning, a chance to speak your truth and finally be heard. But I've come to believe it's something much simpler. It's when your peace stops depending on someone else's remorse. And that's where I was now. Not above it, not healed, just done. But I suppose endings have a way of echoing, even the ones you don't say out loud. One afternoon, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. No greeting, no name, just a single sentence. Can we talk? I stared at it for a long time. The kind of long where the phone screen dims and locks itself twice. I didn't respond, but I didn't delete it either. It stayed there, pinned in my mind, like a bookmark I wasn't ready to close. That night, I went through some old videos. Not because I missed her, but because I wanted to remember. Not who she became, but who she was. In one clip, she was 7 years old, wearing a crooked paper crown, singing off-key into a plastic microphone while I clapped along behind the camera. Her laugh was unfiltered, wild, like she hadn't yet learned how to edit herself for the world. I watched that clip 5 times, not because it was special, but because it reminded me of something no one talks about. How grief isn't just about losing someone. Sometimes it's about realizing they left long before you noticed, that they'd been slipping away one compromise at a time. I paused the video and let the screen fade to black. My reflection stared back, older, quieter, but not broken. And I realized then, maybe healing isn't a sunrise. Maybe it's a slow dimming of the noise, until you're finally alone with the truth. I never asked her why she erased me. Why, on the day that was supposed to be sacred, She decided my absence would be her peace, because deep down, I knew the answer didn't matter. What mattered was what I did with it, and I chose stillness. I chose to let the silence say what words never could. But not everyone can live with silence, especially when it starts to speak louder than their lies. A month passed, then 2, and that's when it happened. A friend of hers, someone I'd met only once briefly, at a holiday party, emailed me out of nowhere. The subject line simply read, "You didn't deserve that." I clicked it open. It wasn't long, just a paragraph, but it said enough that she'd been telling people different stories, that the truth about her finances had finally surfaced, that the groom's family had done some digging, and what they found had unraveled everything. "She's not herself anymore," the email ended. "I thought you should know." I closed it and sat back. The weight didn't feel like victory. It didn't even feel like justice. It felt like confirmation, like the final note in a song I already knew by heart. And yet, I didn't feel relief, just sorrow, because I'd wanted her to be better than that. I wanted to believe that her cruelty came from confusion, or pain, or some deep misunderstanding. But now it just felt like a choice, a cold, calculated choice. And maybe that was the real betrayal. Not that she hurt me, but that she knew exactly what she was doing, and did it anyway. I went for a walk that evening. The air was sharp, the kind that wakes up your skin. I passed by a florist and saw a father holding his daughter's hand, helping her pick flowers for someone. I didn't stop. I didn't stare. But I felt something inside me flinch, not from envy, but from memory, from the ghost of something I once had. That kind of bond isn't built in moments. It's built in the quiet, the rides to school, the notes in lunchboxes, the way your name becomes the first person they call when life gets heavy. And when that disappears, it doesn't go out with a bang. It fades, slowly. Until one day, you realize you haven't been called in years, that your name has been replaced, that your presence now feels like a disruption instead of comfort. I reached home and sat on the porch, watching the sun bow out behind the trees. And I thought, maybe we're not meant to carry every version of love forever. Maybe some chapters aren't about resolution. Maybe they're just about release. And as I sat there breathing in the dusk, another message came through, this time from her. No greeting, just, "Do you hate me?" I didn't respond, because hate is still a connection, and I had nothing left to give. Not even that. I didn't delete that message either. I let it sit there, like a glass of water on a nightstand after a nightmare. Untouched, but somehow necessary. Not because I planned to respond, but because part of me needed to see it with my own eyes. "Do you hate me?" A sentence that came too late from a voice that used to be my entire world, but it wasn't the question that haunted me. It was the fact that she thought she was owed an answer, like everything that had happened, everything she'd said, everything she'd stripped from me, could be measured in a yes or no, as if my silence was the cruelest thing I'd ever done to her. That's the part they never understand, the people who walk away first. They expect grief to follow them like a puppy. They expect the ones they've hurt to fight harder, to shout louder, to beg longer. But when the response is nothing, when the person they broke just doesn't come back, that's what undoes them. Not anger, not revenge, just stillness. I started taking morning walks more often, usually when the streets were empty and the sun hadn't fully decided if it wanted to rise. There's something holy about that silence, something clean. No traffic, no voices, just the rhythm of your own breath and the sound of your shoes meeting the concrete. It became my ritual, my space to process what I didn't have words for. One morning, I passed the old bookstore where she used to beg me to buy her fairy tales, It was closed now, windows dusted, sign faded. But I remembered her tiny fingers tracing the spines of the books, like they were made of gold. This one, Daddy, this one has magic. I had forgotten how much I loved that version of her, the one that still believed in magic, the one that still believed in me. I don't think that girl exists anymore. Maybe she disappeared the day she started believing the world owed her something. Or maybe she disappeared the day she realized I wouldn't always say yes. Either way, she's gone. And the woman who took her place, I don't recognize her. Not just in the things she did, but in the way she rewrote history. I found out later that she'd told people I was controlling, that I made her childhood difficult, that I withheld support to punish her. None of it was true, but I didn't correct it, because I knew the people who mattered already knew better. And the ones who believed her, they were never mine to lose. That's what happens when someone rewrites the past. They think they're protecting their image. But all they're doing is confessing the version of themselves they couldn't live with. I never tried to defend myself, not because I didn't care, but because I was done bleeding to prove I'd been wounded. And still the messages kept coming. A second one, 2 weeks later. I just want to talk. And then another. You're the only person who ever really knew me. Followed by one I never expected. I think I made a mistake. That one I read twice. Not because I believed it, but because it proved something I'd always known. That guilt doesn't visit the innocent. She didn't say what mistake. She didn't name it. She didn't offer an apology or an explanation or even a single acknowledgement of what she did. Just that vague, dangling sentence, I think I made a mistake. That's not remorse. That's regret. And there's a difference. Remorse means you'd undo it if you could. Regret just means you don't like the consequences. I closed the message and turned off my phone. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't want to start expecting anything. Not clarity, not closure, not even kindness. Expectations are the heaviest thing you can carry when someone's already shown you who they are. I went back to the porch that night. Same chair, same quiet. But something had shifted. The air felt sharper, like the sky was holding its breath. And I realized something I hadn't before, that forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the choice not to answer. Sometimes it's the decision to keep walking past the door that hurt you. And sometimes it's realizing that closure isn't a conversation. It's a boundary. That night, I wrote something down for the first time. Not a letter, not a response, just a list. All the things I gave, all the moments I showed up, all the ways I stayed soft, even when life tried to harden me. I didn't write it to send. I wrote it to remember. Because sometimes, after enough silence, even the strongest hearts forget their own worth. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it inside a book she once loved. The same fairy tale she picked from that now-closed store. Then I tucked it away. Not because I needed her to find it, but because I needed to prove to myself that I existed before her and I would still exist after. A few days later, I received something unexpected. A voicemail. Short, hesitant, her voice barely above a whisper. I miss you. That was it. 3 words. Spoken like a question, like she wasn't sure if it was allowed. I listened to it once, then I deleted it. Not out of cruelty, but out of mercy. Because even if she meant it, I didn't anymore. And holding on to someone who only remembers your value when they've lost theirs, that's not love. That's loneliness dressed up in nostalgia. I sat back, eyes closed, and let the silence have me again. It was warmer now. Familiar. Like the body had finally stopped flinching from the absence. And I thought, maybe this is the final form of grief. Not sadness, not anger, just stillness. That's when I knew the ending had already happened. Not with the canceled wedding, not with the missing invitation, not even with her messages. But the moment I stopped waiting for her to understand what she did. That was the real goodbye. Not a slammed door, just a quiet release, a letting go so complete. She didn't even feel it. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. When someone loses you and they don't even hear the sound. The thing about silence is that it doesn't erase memory. It just makes it echo louder. The more I ignored her messages, the more I realized they weren't written for me. They were written for herself, to ease her own guilt, to convince herself that trying, even faintly, somehow balanced the scale. But it didn't. Not when the weight of what she'd done kept pulling me down every time I tried to breathe. And it wasn't just about the wedding, not really. The wedding was just the final thread that snapped. What hurt, what broke me, happened long before that day. It was when I realized she wasn't embarrassed by me because of what I'd done. She was embarrassed because I wasn't who she wanted me to be. I was too simple, too quiet, too much of a reminder of where she came from. And on her wedding day, when everything was glitter and curated perfection, she didn't want the man who raised her. She wanted the story she had told the world about herself, one that didn't include me. That's what finally made something in me shift. Not in rage, not in revenge, just in certainty. I knew I wouldn't be attending that wedding, not because I was uninvited, but because I had already decided, quietly, days before, that my gift to her would be letting her have her version of the story without me. So I canceled the suit fitting. I returned the watch I bought to give her. I cleared the date on my calendar and wrote one word instead: free. And then I did something else. Something I never told anyone until much later. I sent a package. Small, silent, unmarked. It didn't go to her. It went to the groom's family. A soft manila envelope. No threats, no drama. Just facts, photos, documents, a few screenshots. Nothing explosive, nothing illegal. Just truth. About the money, about the debt she hid, about the way she'd spoken about them behind their backs, about the prenup she was planning to manipulate. I didn't embellish. I didn't exaggerate. I just gave them the information they deserved before becoming legally bound to someone they didn't really know. And then I walked away. I didn't wait for a thank you. I didn't ask for credit. I didn't even know what they'd do with it. I just knew if someone had done that for me before I married her mother, I would have lived a very different life. That was the quietest act of love I've ever given, not because it saved anyone, but because it finally saved me. A few days later, I saw it. The headline: Wedding canceled, groom's family cites private concerns. It didn't say my name. It didn't have photos. But I knew. I knew that silence had spoken louder than any speech I could have given. I waited for her to call. She didn't. I waited for her to accuse me. She didn't. Maybe she knew, maybe she didn't. But she never sent another message after that. Just like that. The line went dead. And I felt no relief, no victory, no closure, just breath. Uninterrupted breath. The kind that doesn't tremble. The kind that doesn't brace. That was the real gift. Not the package, not the silence, but the ability to exhale without guilt. People say revenge is loud. They say it burns. But that wasn't revenge. That was peace. Peace carved out of the mess someone else left behind. For a long time, I thought forgiveness meant letting someone back in. Now I know better. Forgiveness is sometimes just knowing that you could have ruined someone, and didn't. It's walking past the fire you could have started. It's not replying to the message that was meant to bait you back into pain. It's choosing to remain still. while the storm circles them instead. I didn't talk about it. Not to friends, not to anyone. Not because I was hiding, but because the moment you tell people what you did, they think it's about justice. And it wasn't. It was about freedom. Mine. So I stayed silent. I let her rebuild whatever version of herself she needed to. I let her tell her own story, one where I was cruel or distant or unforgiving. That was fine. Because I knew my story. And more importantly, I knew hers. A few weeks later, a mutual friend told me she'd moved out of state, started over, left everything behind. I smiled when I heard it, not out of spite, but because maybe, finally, she'd feel what it was like to build something without lying about the foundation. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't beg to be heard. It waits. And when it arrives, it doesn't need applause. It just stands there quietly, while everything false crumbles around it. I haven't seen her since, haven't heard her voice, haven't followed her life. And for the first time in decades, I don't need to. Because some goodbyes don't come with doors slamming or screams. Some goodbyes happen when the silence is respected and kept. And maybe, just maybe, that's the ending she never saw coming. The one where I didn't fight, didn't beg, didn't chase. I just stopped showing up. Completely, quietly, and without warning. Sometimes the people we love the most leave the deepest silence behind. Not because of absence, not because they're gone, but because we finally stopped waiting for them to change. I used to sit by the window long before the wedding, watching her car pull in and out of the driveway without so much as a wave. Back then I told myself she was busy, growing, moving up in the world, that maybe all the little signs, the forgotten calls, the clipped tone, the missed birthdays, were just temporary. But they weren't. They were habits. They were quiet rehearsals for the bigger betrayal that would come later. And when that day arrived, the wedding day, and she looked me in the eye and said she didn't want me there, I understood. Not in a dramatic, storming off kind of way, but in a deeply still, irreversible way. I understood that she had already let go of me long ago, and I had just been too loyal to notice. That's what hurt the most. Not the words, not the scene, but the years I spent holding on to someone who had stopped reaching back. That kind of grief doesn't come with shouting. It comes with long walks through familiar streets that don't feel like home anymore. It comes with folding old shirts you know no one wants. It comes with sitting in your car outside a wedding venue, not because you hope to be invited, but because you need to see one last time what it means to be erased. And when I saw her step out in that dress, radiant, flawless, and hollow, I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation that I had been edited out of her story long before she ever said it aloud. And the moment the groom's family arrived, saw the truth, and turned away, it wasn't revenge, it wasn't justice, it was gravity. The simple fall of false stories when they no longer have support. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I just left, quietly. And for the first time in years, I went home and slept without dreaming. People talk a lot about healing, like it's a loud, visible process. But mine wasn't. Mine was slow, quiet. It looked like morning coffee with no bitterness. It looked like clearing out her old room and turning it into a small art studio. It looked like walking past family photos and not pausing anymore. And when people asked where she was, I just said, living her life. Because that was the truth. And so was I, living mine, without apology, without hope that she'd return, without expectation that she'd understand, just peace. And if that peace looked cold to some, so be it. I had spent too many years burning myself to keep others warm. So now I chose cold. I chose quiet. I chose stillness over stories. And every now and then, when I pass by wedding shops or see a father and daughter laughing in a park, something small tightens in my chest. Not regret, just memory. And I let it come. I let it wash over me, gentle and hollow, like wind through an empty hallway. I don't fight it. I don't relive it. I just nod to it and keep walking. Because closure isn't a door slamming, it's a door that never opens again. And you finally stop knocking. I don't know where she is now. I don't know who she's become. And maybe that's the gift. To not know. To not carry it anymore. Because some stories aren't ours to finish. And some love is only meant to teach us how far we're willing to bend before we finally break. She broke me once, and I thank her for it. Because in the space where I shattered, something stronger grew. Not louder, not harder, just truer. And in that truth, I found myself again. Not the father she wanted, but the man I was always meant to be. The kind who doesn't beg to be included. The kind who doesn't write letters he'll never send. The kind who watches storms roll in and simply stays inside. Safe, still, and whole. If she ever finds this letter, if she ever reads these words, I hope she knows they're not for her. They're for me, for the man who finally let go, for the father who finally stopped waiting, and for the boy inside me who always thought love meant sacrifice. Now I know, real love doesn't ask you to disappear. It sees you. Even in the background, even in the blur, even in the quiet, and it stays. So if you ask me what I gave her on her wedding day, the answer is simple. I gave her exactly what she asked for. I gave her my absence, and then, finally, I gave myself everything else.